want to tell you the story today about the man who lived in the museum. I actually woke up the other night in the middle of the night. My wife and I both actually woke up in the middle of the night, and this was on my brain, and she was awake, and I said, I've got to tell you about this dream I had about a man who lived in the museum. And as I've thought about that dream, it's been elaborated just a bit, but here was a man who wanted to connect with people. He lived in the museum, in the basement of the museum, in the closet of a basement of the museum, and he wanted to connect with people, but what was said of Jesus was true of him. But in our eyes, there was no attractiveness at all. A paraphrase from the Living Bible, Isaiah 53:2, nothing to make us want him. We despised him and rejected him, a man of sorrows, acquainted with the bitterest of grief. We turned our backs on him and looked the other way when he went by. He was despised and we didn't care. And so it was with this man in the museum. He was despised and rejected by men, and so he hid in this closet in the museum, but he wanted to connect with people. And because he wanted to connect with people, he started by moving things around. He started by moving little things around, and he would get little rocks and he would put them in a row, and the scientists would come in and the historians would come in and look at that and say the odds that this happened by random chance are completely beyond the realm of possibility. This must have happened by intelligence. Somebody must have done this, but they did not come to believe in the man who lived in the museum. But it made the man feel a little bit connected because he could overhear their conversation and realize they were talking about them, but he wanted to do more. Again, this man reminds us of what is written in Acts 17. God did this, just as this man did this in my little story here. This verse says God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. And this is what this man wanted. He wanted people to seek him and reach out to him, although he was not far. And so he moved things around. And then when that didn't work or didn't get all the result he wanted, he began to write little letters to the people, write notes at first, and then longer letters. And people would see those letters and were amazed, but they still did not come to believe in him. So he found some people to represent him. He found a man, and he called him down into the basement, and he began to converse with him and reveal himself to him. And he asked this man to go out into the museum and out into the public and tell people about him. And they did, but the people didn't really believe. And so one day, the man walked out of the closet and out of the basement and onto the floor of the museum. And he stood on that stage and he said for all to hear, "Hear ye, hear ye. I am the man who lives in the museum. My father and I actually built this museum, and we want to tell you the meaning of the things that are here. And it will give meaning to all of your life when you come to understand the meaning of the history of this museum." Well, people reacted in different ways. The curator was angry. He felt threatened by the man in the museum. All the attention this man was getting was a threat to him. But the experts, college professors, and historians said, just ignore him. This will pass. This will go away. Don't worry about it. But there was a few people, just a few people, who acknowledged who this man was and believed his message. And so it is with God. He wants to connect with us. And so he performed miracles. He wrote letters, what we call our Christian Bible. He wrote letters to us. He sent representatives, what we would call our prophets, to us. And then he walked on the stage of the earth. And so it was with Christ. As the curator was threatened by the man in the museum, some people were threatened by Christ. Some ignored him, but wise men worship him. Wise men do not simply go to church. They do not simply read their Bibles. They do not simply try to live moral lives. Wise men worship him. We have an old saying that goes, wise men still seek him. And I want to argue from the text here, the real message of the text is, wise men still worship him. So let's look at our passage, Matthew 2, verses 1 through 12. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. You run across a word you don't know too well, a passage you don't understand very well. One of the quickest and easiest ways of discovering more about that is just to look it up in a number of translations and maybe even a paraphrase or two. And in this case, we find the paraphrase, the message, translating this word magi by a band of scholars. A band of scholars. That's a pretty good descriptive phrase of what these people were. They arrived in Jerusalem from the east. Daniel Dorian says the magi were wise men, not kings, as our hymn says it, we three kings, based on this passage here, but they were not kings, but counselors to kings. As with any profession, there were good and bad magi. In the Old Testament, Daniel and his friends were magi, educated men seeking the truth, trained to counsel and advise the king, much like a cabinet of a president or a prime minister. Other magi were charlatans or scoundrels. Acts 8 is an example of that. Our magi seem to be learned, noble, and wealthy, according to Daniel Dorian. Verse 2, and these wise men ask, where is the one who has been born to be king of the Jews? We saw a star when it rose, and we have come to worship him. This word worship is used to designate the custom of prostrating oneself before persons, kissing their feet, or the hem of their garment. In other words, it means to emotionally, wholeheartedly, physically express our adoration, our understanding that God is God and we are not, our adoration for one who is above us. Verse 3, when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. William Barclay has a great commentary on this. He says, but Herod had one terrible flaw. In context, he's talked about the fact that Herod did some wonderful things for the Jews. He rebuilt or refurbished the temple and a lot of other things. But Herod had one terrible flaw in his character. He was almost insanely suspicious. He had always been suspicious, and the older he became, the more suspicious he grew, until in his old age he was, as someone said it, a murderous old man. If he suspected that anyone as a rival to his power, that person was promptly eliminated. He murdered his wife, Merimne, her mother, Alexandra, his eldest son, Antipas, and two other sons, Alexander and Aristobulus. They were all assassinated by him. Augustus, the Roman emperor, had said bitterly that it was safer to be Herod's pig than Herod's son. Something of Herod's savage, bitter, warped nature can be seen from the provision he made when his death came near. When he was 70, he knew that he must surely die soon. So he retired to Jericho, the loveliest of all cities, and he gave orders that a collection of the most distinguished citizens of Jerusalem should be arrested on trumped-up charges and then imprisoned. And he ordered that these upstanding citizens, on the moment he died, the day he died, they should all be killed. He said grimly that he was well aware that no one would mourn for his death, and that he was determined that somebody would shed some tears when he died. And this is why verse 3 says, King Herod, when he heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. It's like that little saying we have, when mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. And when daddy ain't happy, ain't nobody really cares. Well, when Herod wasn't happy, ain't nobody happy. And when he was disturbed, all Jerusalem was disturbed with him. He was like the curator in our little story who was threatened by the man in the museum. Verse 4, when he called together all the people's chief priests and the teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. I want you to observe their reaction, in contrast to his. In Bethlehem, in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. Notice a couple of things about this prophecy, by the way. The first thing you want to notice is that on its face, it is a very clear, forthright prediction that Jesus will be born in Bethlehem. And beyond that, I want you to see that this prediction was understood by the chief priest back in the day. So verse 6, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among all the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. A clear prediction of Jesus coming and being born in Bethlehem. But what I want you to observe is that these chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this message, but they pretty much ignored it, as many people do today. Verse 7, then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find them, report to me so that I too may worship him. And clearly he didn't have in mind to worship him. He had in mind to kill the babies who lived there. Verse 9, after they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. Literally, the Greek says they rejoiced with a great joy, literally a mega joy. It's that word mega in Greek, and they really kind of pile the words on top of each other to say they were really, really happy. They were really, really fired up. Verse 11, on coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and they worshiped him. They opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And this is where we get the idea of we three kings. We talked about the idea of kings a minute ago, and this is where we get the idea of three. We really don't know how many of them there were. Verse 12, and having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. So, three observations from this passage, and that is we have three reactions to Jesus, as we had three reactions to the man in the museum. And the first one is that Herod was threatened by him, as the curator was threatened by the man in the museum. Verse 3 says, when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. We see a similar kind of thing in Acts 14, where it says, at Iconium, Paul and Barnabas went as usual into the Jewish synagogue. They spoke so effectively that a great number of Jews and Greeks believed. And I can't read this passage without saying just a word to you, teacher. Notice that the number of people believed is tied to the effectiveness of Paul and Barnabas' teaching. Because they taught effectively, a great number of people believed. And it is a great challenge to my heart, and I would invite you to see that it is a great challenge to your heart. That part of the result that comes from our ministry is how effective we are in teaching. And I would invite you to continue to join me in giving yourself for the rest of your life. I want to try to get more and more and more effective at teaching the Word of God. But I want you to see the reaction. But the Jews, verse 2, but the Jews who refused to believe stirred up the other Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. Like Herod, they weren't content just to say, it's nothing, it'll blow over. It got them all fired up. We see a similar reaction in Acts 19. Paul entered the synagogue and spoke boldly there for 3 months, arguing persuasively, and not, by the way, just about the message of how to go to heaven when you die, but about the kingdom of God, the central message of the gospel, that God is breaking into planet Earth. But notice a reaction. Verse 9, some of them became obstinate. They refused to believe. They didn't just say there's not enough evidence. They refused to believe, and they publicly maligned the way. So Paul left them. He took the disciples with him and had discussions, and we do well to have discussions, not just lectures, but discussions daily in the lecture hall of Tyrannus. I read an example of this from Today's World, from the Reddit webpage, and notice at the very end of this excerpt, it says, I guess what I'm asking is why can't believers be given the same respect that you would ask would be given to you for your non-belief? And many times, non-believers are not respectful. They don't merely say, well, you believe what you believe and I believe what I believe, and that's that. They are agitated. If you've read any of the books by what are called the New Atheists, these atheists that came on the scene about 10 years or so, you find this vitriol, this anger in their tone. And like Herod, many people are that way today. C.S. Lewis said that when he was an unbeliever, atheism was not only his belief, it was his strongest desire. No word in my vocabulary expressed deeper hatred than the word interference. He was uncomfortably aware that the Hebrew and Christian scriptures placed at the center what seemed to be a transcendental interferer. Atheism appealed to his deep desire to be left alone. Rebels fear being interfered with. So Herod was agitated, he was irritated, he was disturbed. The experts pretty much ignored him. We read this passage where they give the information about where Jesus was born, but they don't go down there themselves. They don't get excited. They don't get excited in a negative way like Herod did. They don't get excited in a positive way. They just are kind of apathetic about this. And again, to quote another quote from C.S. Lewis, he says, you have to keep forcing them back. And again, back to the real point. He's saying when you share with others, when you witness, you need to bring them back to the main point. Only thus will you be able to undermine their belief that a certain amount of religion, this is how many people are today, a certain amount of religion is desirable, but one mustn't carry it too far. One must keep on pointing out that Christianity is a statement which, if false, is of no importance at all. And if true, it is of infinite importance. It is of infinite importance. The one thing it cannot be is moderately important. And yet this is what the Pharisees and the teachers of the law seem to see at this point, because they won't feel that way eventually. But at this point, they seem to indicate that this message can be safely ignored. Just don't pay a lot of attention to it. And many people today say, you have your religion and I have mine, and they think it can be safely ignored. But the example we want to follow from this text is the wise men. And the wise men didn't just seek him. The wise men worshiped him. Verse 11, on coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and they worshiped him. And so it is today. Some are threatened, some ignore, and wise men still worship him. And you want to invite your people to be like those wise men who spend their days worshiping God, who spend their days listening to music and being prompted by worshipful music on a regular basis to sing and adore and worship our great God. And may God richly bless you as you teach your people to be worshipers this week.